You might have seen those news stories where someone just jumps into the water or goes into a burning building in order to save someone. They're not entirely thinking logically, they're acting on instinct. And as dramatic as that may sound, we are instinctively made to act. And whilst in some situations that's great as you need to act immediately, coming from a productivity standpoint, when we're favouring action over inaction, sometimes it may not necessarily be to your benefit. And we do this in so many situations where we favour action over inaction, even when we know when it might not be in our benefit. There are times where we can get stuff done, and when we get a taste of this productive self, it feels good. Maybe it's for 1 hour where all of a sudden all your creative ideas come, or you just get embedded into reading that book that you've been meaning to do. Our desires are always whispering to us, and even though that we may want to respond to them, sometimes we don't, because life is always calling. Whether someone needs help with something, or you've got a family requirement, or the demands from work for the current time being have increased and you find increasingly that your evenings are taken up by it. Whatever it is, all these demands that life is wanting from you sometimes all leak into each other. The urgency of life is always calling, and that call is sometimes really loud. And I think sometimes we have a tendency to want to do all these things and put out all these fires, and we respond to whatever is calling out the loudest, which may not be the most important thing. And I think generally we see taking action as a good thing. If we're taking action, it means that we're doing something. And I think sometimes we rationalize doing something over doing nothing, because if you're doing something, that just feels better, right? And I think this bias for action comes from wanting some type of control. If we're taking control, we're seen to be doing something. Essentially, taking action makes us feel better. The way we approach it, we kind of need to be really careful. Sometimes if we're overconfident in our judgments, it can lead us to taking decisions that put us at risk. Just look at the financial markets, where overconfidence causes people to trade more frequently than they should. They think that certain decisions would lead to lucrative outcomes. They attempt to predict the future and the stocks, whether it's going to fall or rise. And granted, in some cases it may pay off, but most traders realize over time that a hands-off approach is actually better. And you see this in the markets. When it's down, panic takes over, and this leads to an action bias. You're constantly checking your portfolio, you'll open up the app, whether it's to see whether it's gone down or up, to see whether you're in the green or red, and this just changes your attention. When you notice a slight change in the value, you're like, right, okay, this is the best time for me to come out. You want to hedge your bets to minimize your losses. It's just part of the game of how it works. They're temporary and they often right themselves over time. And I actually had some first-hand experience on this. You need to essentially put your money in and be comfortable in the fact of, if it goes up or down in a short amount of time, it's okay. And the money you do sort of put in there, that's the money that you're willing to risk. You haven't overextended yourself. And I've put money away knowing that I'm not going to touch it for years to come. Because looking at that every day or even every week, it does something mentally. You're going to feel some type of way when you see your money's going down. And I always say to myself, never make a decision in fear, scarcity, or lack. Whenever you're in this state, you're never really going to make a right decision. And avoiding this illogical action bias requires you to unlearn habits that you've built over time. And it's funny how things surface to the mind when it comes to talking about this subject. When I worked in retail as a teenager, I remember talking to a colleague and she said to me, don't walk so slow because the managers might say something to you or you're going to get more work. And she said, instead, walk quicker. When you walk quicker, it looks like you're more busy. It looks like you're doing more. They got less hassle from the management and ultimately got less work thrown at them. And another example of the action bias, imagine yourself in traffic. You're sitting there, you're not moving, you're probably hot, you're stressed, and the sat-nav suggests to you to go to another room. But mind you, it's going to get there at exactly the same time, but without the traffic. So it's going to feel like you're moving faster. Most of us sometimes would actually take the second route. We would rather take that route because we're moving. And this is another action bias. Why is it that we would rather do this even though we're going to get there at the same time? Because inherently it feels better because we're moving or we're doing something. So as you can see, taking action constantly is not always the best judgment to make. So when we're giving up, it doesn't mean that we're giving up entirely. Let's say, for example, you've met someone and let's say it's the work situation and they don't say much, but when they do say something, you listen. This is a person actually activating their judgments. They're not just speaking for the sake of speaking. They're not just doing something for the sake of doing something. But when they do something or when they say something, people listen because they've taken the opportunity to be thoughtful of what they're going to do or say. This shows that they've really thought about it and they really want to hit home, or they really want to be careful and be precise in what they want to say. They have chosen when to act. They are actually practicing patience, which in this day and age, frankly, is quite hard to develop. And I think choosing when to act comes under a type of self-control, which is a lifelong skill. And it involves going against your natural impulse just to act or do something. Whether it's cutting off someone mid-speech or going onto Twitter saying something that you're only later on going to regret. And I'm actually experiencing this right now. I recently had a conversation with someone, and on first impressions, it wasn't really great. But after some time questioning them, trying to maintain a positive energy, I actually found out that they were just having a bad day. And that took me to sort of just take a step back, to pause and just to really think, right, is this person actually conveying what they want to convey to me? And that was one situation where I could have just jumped to a conclusion and thought, this is the way this person's going to be. So unless action demands immediate action, pause. Take time to think about the consequences of a particular action. Think about the consequences of action versus inaction. This is controlled patience at its best. Remember, the goal is not to 100% get rid of action, it's to be more selective, to be more precise, to be laser focused on what actions you do need to take. And I know this sounds basic, but imagine a tree getting chopped down by an axe. That is the same action being repeated time and time again, where in exactly the same area. You're laser focused in that particular area to have a precise and particular outcome. When you give equal consideration to inaction as a possible response, you avoid this automatic knee-jerk reaction to things. And in doing so, this will allow you to make more effective decisions, which eventually will lead you to more profitable outcomes.